And Senator, don't forget to take your devices to the floor. Don't forget to drop your devices to the floor.
Denounce that violence by those criminals that occurred in this very chamber, this very building. There was a reason why we started our presentation back on Tuesday in that way. Because I did not want the senators to consider that there was any challenge to that particular fact. And yet, the House managers, knowing it was not contested at all, chose to spend 14+ hours showing you pictures of how horrific the attack on the United States Capitol was. They spent no time at all in connecting legally the attack on the Capitol to the 45th President of the United States, which is the only question that needs to be answered, is, was Donald Trump responsible for inciting the violence that came to this building on January 6th? Now, by any measure, President Trump is the most pro-police, anti-mob rule president this country has ever seen. His real supporters know this. He made it clear throughout his presidency. He made it clear during the violence this past summer. He made it clear on January 6th. But politics changes things. Politics has created and interposed an element that should not be here. It has interposed the element of hatred. And the political world changes when hatred becomes part of the dynamic. As we wrote in our answer, to the original charging document. And I hope that this is a phrase that lives on long after we are all departed, and that I hope someday this becomes the mantra by which all of us operate who work for the benefit of the public. That political hatred has no place in the American justice system, and most certainly no place in the Congress of the United States. To illustrate the contrast that I am speaking of, we have a video.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
The vast majority of the protesters have been peaceful.
Republicans stand for law and order, and we stand for justice.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
My administration will always stand against violence, mayhem, and disorder.
There needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
I stand with the heroes of law enforcement.
And you push back on them, and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
We will never defund our police. Together, we will ensure that America is a nation of law and order.
We were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
I think you need to go back and punch him in the face.
Feel like punching him.
We just want law and order. Everybody wants that.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price.
We want law and order. We have to have law and order.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
We believe in safe streets, secure communities, and we believe in law and order.
Is there truly anyone in this chamber who disagrees with the words as spoken by President Trump on that video? Surely not. Surely not. This contrast, and in this context, I ask you to keep that in mind. My colleagues here, actually my colleague here, Mr. Raskin, hopes that you don't. They have used selective editing and manipulated visuals to paint a picture far different from this truth. Make no mistake, and I will repeat it now and anytime I'm ever asked, January 6th was a terrible day for our country. The attack on this building shocked us all. President Trump did not incite or cause the horrific violence that occurred on January 6th, 2021. They know that. We know the president did not incite the riot because of his plain words that day, as Mr. Vanderveen elucidated on a few moments ago. We know the president could not have incited the riots because of the timeline of the events of that day. We heard a great deal from the House manager about their prosecutorial bona fides and their ability to analyze evidence, apply it to statutes, use timelines, and figure out what happened based on circumstantial evidence and direct evidence and testimony and forensic analysis. I can't recall any of the House managers who got up that didn't make some reference to prosecutorial bona fides. Well, I spent more than 3 decades locking up killers, and I do know a little bit about applying the facts to the law. We know that the president would never have wanted such a riot to occur because his long-standing hatred for violent protesters and his love for law and order is on display, worn on his sleeve, every single day that he served in the White House. But if we're going to apply the facts to the statute, it has to be done systematically. It has to be done with precision, the way a court would expect us to do that. Let's look at the letter of the law, Again, Mr. Vanderveen gave you an overview of the Brandenburg case and some of the related cases. You notice that when Mr. Vanderveen listed the elements that he took verbatim or close to verbatim right out of Vandenberg, they bore no reference whatsoever to the elements that were flashed up by the Democrat managers the other day repeatedly. He actually used the Supreme Court's case. He didn't make it up. Let's look at the letter of the law. The Supreme Court of the United States, over 50 years ago, laid out a clear test to determine whether speech is incitement. Under that test, the Brandenburg versus Ohio test, there are 3 elements that must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt by a preponderance of the evidence, whatever the Senate considers, I suggest, beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the speech in question must explicitly or implicitly encourage the use of violence or lawless action. But here, the president's speech called for peaceful protest. Second, the speaker must intend that his speech will result in the use of violence or lawless action. And again, as Mr. Vanderveen pointed out, the president clearly deplores rioters and political violence and did so throughout his term as president and never hesitated to express his admiration for the men and women that protect this country. Finally, the third element under the Brandenburg test is the imminent use of violence. Imminent use of violence. In other words, right then, the imminent use of violence or lawless action must be the likely result of the speech. The likely result of the speech. Well, that argument is completely eviscerated by the fact that the violence was pre-planned, as confirmed by the FBI, Department of Justice, and even the House managers, not the result of the speech at all. Several of my colleagues at the House managers got up and spoke about the proceeding in the House being like a grand jury proceeding. Well, I've been in grand jury proceedings. I have run grand juries. In grand jury proceedings, you call witnesses. You hear evidence. You make transcripts. You take affidavits. You develop physical evidence. You hear reports from police officers. You hear forensic analysis from scientists. In fact, you invite the target of the grand jury to come in and testify if he or she pleases to be heard by the grand jury. Which one of those things happened in the House prior to the impeachment article? I don't believe any of them happened. So the suggestion that what happened in the House was anything at all like a grand jury investigating a case and preferring it for prosecution is complete nonsense. And if the House managers are trying to fool you about that, you must ask yourself, what else are they trying to fool you about? Let's look more closely at the president's speech. We have mentioned this line before, but it is so critical we need to talk about it again. The president asked that the attendees at his rally peacefully make their voices heard.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
The managers would have you believe that the president's supporters usually follow his every word, but in this case, imputed some imaginary meaning to them while ignoring his most clear instructions. President Trump said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, and the House managers took from that, go down to the Capitol and riot. So you are supposed to put yourselves in the heads of the people who here peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard and conclude that those words do not mean what the president said. More than that, the president criticized the destruction wrought by left-wing anarchists and rioters. He told his supporters that they build, they don't destroy.
If this happened to the Democrats, there'd be hell all over the country going on. There'd be hell all over the country. But just remember this, you're stronger, you're smarter, you've got more going than anybody, and they try and demean everybody having to do with us. And you're the real people. You're the people that built this nation. You're not the people that tore down our nation.
Is it possible, listening to those words in the proper cadence without them being edited or the sound changed so that they're indistinguishable or sounds as though the crowd is right there, but listening to it as you have here, unedited by us, is it possible that President Trump's disdain for political violence could be any clearer to the persons listening as he was speaking? Is it possible that his words could have been misunderstood? I suggest to you that is impossible. Now, the House manager said the president told the crowd, quote, "You have to get out your people to fight." The House manager's claim is that the President of the United States was telling the audience to get each other to physically fight. But that is not what the President said. The people who should fight, he said, were members of Congress. If they don't fight, what the President said is, what should the rally attendees do? If members of Congress wouldn't fight for the principles they held dear, what was it that the President specifically told his supporters at that rally he wanted them to do? He wanted them to support primary challenges. Now, nobody in this chamber is anxious to have a primary challenge. That is one truism I think I can say with some certainty. But that's the way we operate in this country. When the people of a state want to change their representatives and their senators, they use the electoral process. President Trump told his listeners that if their members of Congress won't fight for their views, then go back home and find others that will. That's what President Trump said. The people who should fight were the members of Congress.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them.
You have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them, we're gonna let you know who they are. I can already tell you, frankly.
It is pretty stark contrast when you watch that video, isn't it? When you see the House manager tell you, and I don't know if we're under oath here, but when I walked into this room, I sure as heck felt I was under oath and that I was speaking not only to senators of the United States, but before the entire world and with God watching. And a House manager got up here and told you that the President of the United States on January the 6th, 2021, told the crowd that they had to go and fight. And the implication that they wanted you to draw was that he was sending them down to Capitol Hill to go and breach the building and trash the very sacred halls of Congress. But we now know that is not at all anything near what the president said. What the president said was, if you can't get your members of Congress to do as you would like them to do, you primary them. That's the American way. The first way that the House managers presented and wanted you to conclude, that's the criminal way. But what the president said was the American way. Again, House managers manipulated President Trump's words. I can't stand here and pretend to tell you that I know every time from all those videos that the House managers manipulated what the president said, put up evidence that was not with the foundation of correctness and admissibility we expect. I can't tell you that I picked up every one. I don't think Mr. Van der Veen or Mr. Schoen or any of the others that worked with us can tell you that. But what I can tell you is that there were an awful lot of times, and I know at least some of you were judges in previous lives, and if one of the lawyers was able to create the impression that one side intentionally presented false or misleading evidence, that judge would give an instruction called falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one thing, false in everything. In other words, if they're trying to fool you about one thing, not only might they be trying to fool you in something else, but under that maxim of the law, you may conclude they're trying to fool you in everything else. President Trump was immediate in his calls for calm and respect for law enforcement. The House managers emphasized President Trump's tweet in the 6 p.m. hour where he told crowds to, quote, go home in love and peace and remember this day. What is it that they left out? Well, the House starts their recitation of what President Trump said as far as the aftermath of when the Capitol was breached at roughly 6 p.m. What they don't tell you and didn't tell you, and which you probably don't know because I think I'm the first one to say it in this forum, is at 2:38, President Trump urged protesters at the U.S. Capitol to, quote, stay peaceful, please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful. And before we run the graphic, I just want to point out to you, President Trump's speech ended at 1:11 p.m. So at 2:38 p.m., by the time word reaches the president that there's a problem down here, he's out urging people to support the police, stay peaceful, support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are on the side of the country. Stay peaceful. At 3:13 p.m., President Trump urged protesters at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. 3:13 p.m. President Trump's words couldn't have incited the riot at the Capitol. The day's events make this clear. Let's walk through the actual timeline. At 11:15 a.m., police security camera videos show crowds forming at First Street near the Capitol reflecting pool. This is a full 45 minutes before President Trump even took the stage on January 6th. Let me repeat that. Violent criminals were assembling at the Capitol over a mile away almost an hour before the president uttered a single word on the ellipse. You did not hear that fact during the hours and hours of the House manager's presentation, did you? When the president spoke, what did he call for? He called for rally attendees to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard, for them to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to cheer on members of Congress. President Trump went on for more than an hour, ending at 1:11. Now, why is this important? Because of all of the events that I am about to describe, they all occurred before President Trump's remarks concluded. At 12:49 p.m., the first barriers at the U.S. Capitol grounds were pushed over and the crowd entered the restricted area. At 11:05 p.m., Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller received open source reports of demonstrator movements to the U.S. Capitol. At 1:09 p.m., U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund called the House and Senate sergeants at arms, telling them he wanted an emergency declared and he wanted the National Guard called. The point? Given the timeline of events, the criminals at the Capitol weren't there at the ellipse to even hear the president's words. They were more than a mile away, engaged in their pre-planned assault on this very building. This was a pre-planned assault, make no mistake, and that is a critical fact. Watch this.
Does anyone in this chamber honestly believe that but for the conduct of President Trump, that charged in the article of impeachment, that attack at the Capitol would have occurred? Does anybody believe that?
It was not some sort of spontaneous decision by a bunch of, quote, protesters to go up to Capitol Hill and storm Capitol Hill. This was all planned out.
How much of it was planned? How much of this was strategized ahead of time?
They are getting indications, some evidence that they've seen that indicates that there was some level of planning.
There appears to be premeditation.
FBI internal report the day before the siege, warning of a violent war at the Capitol.
The FBI issued a warning of a, quote, war at the Capitol.
The FBI warned law enforcement agencies about this specific attack.
Be ready to fight. Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in.
We developed some intelligence that a number of individuals were planning to travel to the D.C. area with intentions to cause violence. We immediately shared that information.
And they pushed out that information through this JTTF structure.
It was immediately disseminated through a written product and briefed through our command post operations to all levels of law enforcement.
The FBI says 2 pipe bombs discovered near the Capitol on January 6th were placed there the night before.
New video appears to show a person suspected of planting pipe bombs near the U.S. Capitol the night before.
The FBI now says the bombs were planted the night before the Capitol siege between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m.
They were planted the day before.
All goes to the idea of premeditation and coordination among individuals.
This was a planned assault as if going after a castle.
So to answer the question of the House manager, does anybody believe that this would have occurred but for the speech from Donald Trump? I do. All of these facts make clear the January 6th speech did not cause the riots. The president did not cause the riots. He neither explicitly or implicitly encouraged the use of violence or lawless action, but in fact called for peaceful exercise of every American's First Amendment rights to peacefully assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. In other words, the Brandenburg Standard is not made out. The House managers admitted many facts are unknown. Even Speaker Pelosi admitted not knowing the real cause of the violence when she called for a 9/11-style commission to examine the facts and causes that led to the violence. On the screen is Speaker Pelosi's call for the 9/11 commission. Let's touch now on the second absurd and conflated allegation in the House manager's single article. President Trump's phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Ben Roethlisberger, surreptitiously recorded, by the way, included multiple attorneys and others on the call. Let me point out the very obvious fact that the House managers ignored. The private call that was made public by others cannot really be the basis to claim that the president intended to incite a riot, because he did not publicly disclose the contents of the call. How could he have hoped to use this call to invite his followers if he had no intent to make the conversation public and indeed had nothing to do with it being secretly recorded? The House managers told you that the president demanded that the Georgia Secretary of State, quote, find just over 11,000 votes. The word find, like so many others the House managers highlighted, is taken completely out of context. And the word find did not come out of thin air. Based on an analysis of publicly available voter data that the ballot rejection rate in Georgia in 2016 was approximately 6.42%. And even though a tremendous amount of new first-time mail-in ballots were included in the 2020 count, the Georgia rejection rate in 2020 was a mere 0.4%, a drop-off from 6.42% to 0.4%. President Trump wanted the signature verification to be done in public. How can a request for signature verifications to be done in public be a basis for a charge for inciting a riot? With that background, it is clear that President Trump's comments and the use of the word find were solely related to his concerns with the inexplicable dramatic drop in Georgia's ballot rejection rates. Let's examine how the word find was used throughout that conversation. Mr. Trump's first use of the word find was as follows, quote, we think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple 100,000 of forged signatures of people who have been forged. And we are quite sure that's going to happen. President Trump also used find as follows, quote, now why aren't we doing signature and why can't it be open to the public? And why can't we have professionals do it instead of rank amateurs who will never find anything and don't want to find anything? They don't want to find, they don't want to find anything. Someday you'll tell me the reason why, because I don't understand your reasoning. But someday you'll tell me the reason why. But why don't you want to find? President Trump echoed his previous sentiments, again in the context of pursuing a legitimate and robust investigation into the lack of signature verification for mail-in and absentee ballots. Quote, and why can't we have professionals do it instead of rank amateurs who will never find anything and don't want to find anything? They don't want to find anything, they don't want to find anything. They don't want to find, they don't want to find anything. Someday you'll tell me why, because I don't understand your reasoning, but someday you'll tell me why. But why don't you want to find? We can go through signature verification and we'll find hundreds of thousands of signatures, and you can let us do it. And the only way you can do it, as you know, is to go to the past. But you didn't do that in Cobb County. You just looked at one page compared to another. The only way you could do a signature verification is to go from one that signed it on November whatever, recently, and compare it to 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, or even one. And you'll find that you have many different signatures. But in Fulton, where they dumped ballots, you will find that you have many that aren't even signed and that you have many forgeries." End quote. Mr. Trump continued to use the word "fine" throughout the conversation. Each and every other time in the context of his request that Mr. Raffensperger undertake a review of signature verifications, and his concerns generally with ballot integrity and his reported electoral deficit, here are a few examples. Quote, "But why wouldn't you want to find the right answer, Brad? Instead of keep saying that the numbers are right, because those numbers are so wrong." Another example, quote, "We think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple 100,000 of forged signatures of people who have been forged, and we are quite sure that's going to happen." End quote. Moreover, there was nothing untoward with President Trump, or any other candidate for that matter, speaking with the lead elections officer of a state. That's why the Georgia Secretary of State took a call along with members of his team, one of whom decided to record it and release it to the press. The only reason this conversation is being discussed in this chamber is because, once again, the media and their Democratic allies distorted the true conversation to mislead you and the American public. So we have a complete lack of evidence for the article of impeachment presented by the House managers. So why are we here? Politics. Their goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters.
Why bother with a Senate trial of Donald Trump? He's no longer president.
He'll be out of office anyway.
Is it to keep him from ever running again?
Make sure he can never run for office again.
Keep him from running for office again.
Donald Trump would not be able to run for office again.
Barring him from running for office again.
Disqualified from running for office.
Disqualify him from ever running from office again.
Disqualified from running for office again.
It's about focusing that he can never run again.
Remove him from ever running for office again.
Never be able to run for office again.
To ban former President Trump from running again.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
The goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters. Members of the Senate, our country needs to get back to work. I know that you know that. But instead, we are here. The majority party promised to unify and deliver more COVID relief. But instead, they did this. We will not take most of our time today, us of the defense, in the hopes that you will take back these hours and use them to get delivery of COVID relief to the American people. Let us be clear. This trial is about far more than President Trump. It is about silencing and banning the speech the majority does not agree with. It is about canceling 75 million Trump voters and criminalizing political viewpoints. That is what this trial is really about. It's the only existential issue before us. It asks for constitutional cancel culture to take over in the United States Senate. Are we going to allow canceling and banning and silencing to be sanctioned in this body? To the Democrats who view this as a moment of opportunity, I urge you instead to look to the principles of free expression and free speech. I hope truly that the next time you are in the minority, you don't find yourself in this position. To the Republicans in this chamber, I ask, when you are next in the majority, please resist what will be an overwhelming temptation to do this very same thing to the opposing party. Members of the Senate, this concludes the formal defense of the 45th President of the United States to the impeachment article filed by the House of Representatives. I understand that there is a procedure in place for questions, and we await them. Thereafter, we will close on behalf of President Trump. Mr. President, we yield the balance.
And I ask unanimous consent. We take a 15-minute recess.
Without objection, the Senate will stand in recess.
I think the President's lawyers blew the House manager case out of the water. They legally eviscerated them. I think their arguments, they showed the distortions of the tweets, the selective editing, showed the reason why due process is important. And they certainly proved that the First Amendment applies to political speech probably more than anything. So again, I think the President's lawyers just blew the House manager case out of the water. Thank you.
Somebody coming out this way?
Not Senator, but Senator, yes.
No, you guys are not senator. They're back there by the elevator. Stamina? Back there? That's stamina. Yeah, that's that. Yeah, it's stamina.
I'll give him credit for at least.
Taking notes.
And also being like, did you visit?
Right.
All that has been, I can think it's 16. It would have truly been like, show me 16 days.
He was never going to get to
Shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and
She's everybody's person. Yeah, exactly. Too fun. Yeah, especially because you get to go visit them. Whoa. Careful where you point that thing. It's tight. You know there are 5 very, very small honors for women. Wires running through that case. Very prone to breaking. Actually, how you do it. It's on 128. I got stuff to say.
Do this with a slow shutter speed. It's very hardy. Set the rear shutter.
Oh, yeah?
Well, half it makes it.
Hi, how are you? I'm good. So the defense continued to focus on the president's remarks on January 6th, when we all know that there was months of a lead up to his remarks on January 6th that had to do with the big lie, culminating in the January 6th speech where he had to have known that there would be violence, they were prepared for violence, and he just lit the match. And the Mr. Law and Order president, once the riots were going on, did absolutely nothing to tell the rioters and the insurrectionists, stop. Nothing. Also, the Mr. Law and Order rule of law president is the same guy who says, I could shoot a guy on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Yeah, that's the law and order rule of law president. That's
Senator,
all I have
what
to
do
say.
you think of their using the endless montage of Democrats saying fight, fight, fight? Are these the same things?
Of course not. Of course not. This, what about them? What about this? What about that? Has nothing to do with the real question which is, did the president incite an insurrection that led to rioters at the Capitol ending up in 7 people dying? That is the question. The focus is on what he did, not what everybody else did or said. It was so childish. It was so to me, just totally pathetic and amateurish.
Were you surprised that his legal team brought up questions again about the validity of the election as well? They were talking about, they were arguing that President Trump was allowed to raise questions about the...
That was ridiculous, because when they tried to argue that the president was telling the crowd, yes, you should wait until the election 2 years from now to go get the people who didn't agree with you, at the same time as they're all waiting, thousands of them, and he tells them to go march on the Capitol and fight like hell. So that was another, I just found that argument to be just, it was like an alternative universe recitation of what was really going on in that crowd and what their beliefs were, what they were prepared to do.
Do you have questions that you plan to ask during the question and answer period?
I'd like to ask why the president didn't do anything or say anything that said, you rioters, stop what you're doing right now, stop right now. He didn't do that. I'd also like to know whether the president's team believes that there was a free and fair election and that Joe Biden is the duly elected president of the United States. I don't know if those questions will be asked, but yeah, I'd kind of like to know.
Do you have a problem with some of the Republican senators seem to be working with the Trump legal team, having private meetings in between the sessions?
Well, that goes to show that this is an impeachment trial, and so it is what the senators determined to be the president having incited an insurrection, and whether to us that constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor leading to an impeachment conviction.
How do you think Americans outside this chamber are hearing this defense? They keep claiming that the House managers fabricated.
Well, I hope that the American people will recognize that I would say most people have used words like, we need to fight back, we need to stand up for our rights and all of that. But how many of us have said that and caused thousands of people to march on the Capitol and proceed to destroy the Capitol and beat police officers? No, if they actually found someone who did that, no, that would be an apt comparison. But there was none of that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate your time.
Sooner rather than later, or later rather than sooner, or sooner than later. Directly. Directly.
To stop the transfer of power, to stop from losing the presidency. And he said things like, quote, fight to the death, and January 6th will be a, quote, wild and, quote, historic day. And this was working. They got the message. In the days leading to the attack, report after report, social media post after social media post confirmed that these insurgents were planning armed violence. But they were planning it because he had been priming them, because he had been amping them up. That's why they were planning it. And these posts, confirmed by reports from the FBI and Capitol Police, made clear that
to 5 minutes each. And if the questions are directed to both parties, the times be equally divided. Furthermore, that questions alternate sides for posing questions for as long as both sides have questions.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. President, I have a question at the desk, for the desk.
The senator will submit it. The question from Senator Schumer and Senator Feinstein is directed to the House managers. The clerk will read it.
Isn't it the case that the violent attack and siege on the Capitol on January 6th would not have happened if not for the conduct of President Trump?
Of up to 5 minutes.
To answer your question very directly, Donald Trump summoned the mob. He assembled a mob and he lit the flame. Everything that followed was because of his doing. And although he could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence, he never did. In other words, this violent, bloody insurrection that occurred on January 6th would not have occurred but for President Trump. The evidence we presented at trial makes this absolutely clear. And this attack, as we said, didn't come from one random speech, and it didn't happen by accident, and that mob didn't come out of thin air. Before the election, Donald Trump spread lie after lie about potential fraud. An election, remember, that hadn't even happened yet. Months before the election took place, he was saying it was rigged, that it was going to be stolen, all to make his supporters believe that the only way he was going to lose is if the election was stolen, if the election was rigged. And when he did lose, he spent week after week inciting his supporters to believe that their votes had been stolen and that the election was fraudulent and that it was their patriotic duty to fight like hell to stop the steal and take their country back. And remember, this is in the United States where our vote is our voice. You tell somebody that an election victory is being stolen from them, that's a combustible situation. And he gave them clear direction on how to deal with that. For example, on December 19th, 18 days prior to January 6th, President Trump told them how and where to fight for it. He first issued his call to action for January 6th. This was a save the date sent 18 days before the event on January 6th. And it wasn't just a casual one-off reference or a singular invitation. For the next 18 days, he directed all of the rage he had incited to January 6th. And that was, for him, what he saw as his last chance to stop the transfer of power, to stop from losing the presidency. And he said things like, quote, fight to the death, and January 6th will be a, quote, wild and, quote, historic day. And this was working. They got the message. In the days leading to the attack, report after report, social media post after social media post confirmed that these insurgents were planning armed violence. But they were planning it because he had been priming them, because he had been amping them up. That's why they were planning it. And these posts, confirmed by reports from the FBI and Capitol Police, made clear that these insurgents were planning to carry weapons, including guns, to target the Capitol itself. And yet, Donald Trump, from January 5th to the morning of his speech, tweeted 34 times, urging his supporters to get ready to stop the steal. He even, on the eve of the attack, warned us that it was coming. He warned us that thousands were descending into D.C. and would not take it anymore. And when they got here at the Save America March, he told them again in that speech exactly what to do. His lawyer opened with, quote, let's have trial by combat. That was Rudy Giuliani. And Donald Trump brought that message home. In fact, he praised Rudy Giuliani as a fighter. And President Trump used the words fight or fighting 20 times in that speech. Remember, you've just told these people, these thousands of people, that somebody has stolen your election, your victory. You're not going to get the president that you love. Senators, that is an incredibly combustible situation when people are armed and they've been saying that they're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. He looked out to a sea of thousands, some wearing body armor, helmets, holding sticks and flagpoles, some of which they would later use to beat Capitol Police, and told them that they could play by different rules. Play by different rules. He even at one point quite literally pointed to the Capitol as he told them to fight like hell. And after the attack, we've shown clearly, that once the attack began, insurgent after insurgent made clear they were following the president's orders. You saw us present that evidence of the insurgents who were there that day, who said, I came because the president asked me to come. I was here at his invitation. You saw that of the folks that were in the Capitol that day.
The time has expired. Are there further questions?
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina, have a question?
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Submit it.
I send a question to the desk on behalf of myself, Senator Cruz, Marshall, and Kramer to council.
Senator Graham for himself, Senator Cruz, Senator Marshall, and Senator Kramer submits a question for the counsel for Donald Trump. Clerk will read it.
Does a politician raising bail for rioters encourage more rioting?
Counsel has 5 minutes.
Yes.
Does counsel yield back the rest of their time? Council's time is yielded back. Are there other questions?
Mr. President.
The Senator from Georgia.
I have a question for the desk.
Send it to the desk. The Senator from Georgia, Senator Warnock, has a question for the House managers. Clerk will read the question.
Is it true or false that in the months leading up to January 6th, dozens of courts, including state and federal courts in Georgia, rejected President Trump's campaign's efforts to overturn his loss to Joe Biden?
House managers recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. President, Senators, that is true. That's true. I want to be clear, though, that we have absolutely no problem with President Trump having pursued his belief that the election was being stolen or that there was fraud or corruption or unconstitutionality. We have no problem at all with him going to court to do it. And he did, and he lost in 61 straight cases, in federal court and state court, in the lowest courts in the land, in the U.S. Supreme Court. He lost it. He lost in courts in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, and Wisconsin. All of them said the same thing. They couldn't find any corruption. They couldn't find any fraud, certainly nothing rising to a material level that would alter the outcome of any of the elections, and there was no unconstitutionality. That's the American system. And so, I mean, it's hard to imagine him having gotten more due process than that in pursuing what has come to be known popularly as the big lie, the idea that somehow the election was being stolen from him. And we have no problem with the fact that he went to court to do all those things. But notice, number one, the big lie was refuted, devastated, and demolished in federal and state courts across the land, including by 8 judges appointed by President Donald Trump himself. We quoted earlier in the case what happened in Pennsylvania, where U.S. District Court Judge Matthew Brown said, In the United States, the court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations. In the U.S., this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its sixth most populous state. Our people, laws, and institutions demand more. Then it went up to Judge Stefanos Bibas, who's a Trump appointee, who was a part of the appeals court panel. He said, the campaign's claims have no merit. The number of ballots it specifically challenges is far smaller than the 81,000 vote margin of victory, and it never claims fraud or that any votes were cast by illegal voters. Plus, tossing out millions of mail-in ballots would be drastic and unprecedented, disenfranchising a huge swath of the electorate and upsetting all of the down-ballot races, too, which incidentally weren't being challenged, even though it was the exact same ballot that had been brought. So the problem was when the president went from his judicial combat, which was fine, to intimidating and bullying state election officials and state legislators, and then finally, as Representative Cheney said, summoning a mob, assembling a mob, and then lighting the match for an insurrection against the Union. When he crossed over from nonviolent means, no matter how ridiculous or absurd, that's fine, he's exercising his rights, to inciting violence. That's what this trial is about. And we heard very little of that from the presentation of the president's lawyers. They really didn't address the facts of the case at all. There were a couple propaganda reels about Democratic politicians that would be excluded in any court in the land. They talked about the rules of evidence. All of that was totally irrelevant to the case before us. Whatever you think about it, it's irrelevant. And we'll be happy, of course, to address the First Amendment arguments, too.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.
The question is from Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. It is for the counsel for the former president. Clerk will read.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? What specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Clerk, read that question again. We're getting it back.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? And what specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Mr. Van Veen.
The House managers have given us absolutely no evidence one way or the other onto that question. We're able to piece together a timeline and it goes all the way back to December 31st, January 2nd. There is a lot of interaction between the authorities and getting folks to have security beforehand. On the day, we have a tweet at 2:38, so it was certainly sometime before then. With the rush to bring this impeachment, there's been absolutely no investigation into that. And that's the problem with this entire proceeding. The House managers did zero investigation, and the American people deserve a lot better than coming in here with no evidence, hearsay on top of hearsay on top of reports that are of hearsay. Due process is required here, and that was denied.
Mr. President,
And the Senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.